Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar, brought to you by TechStrong. My name is Cody J. Brown, and I will be moderating today's session. We have an exciting presentation ahead of us, but before we begin, I have just a few housekeeping notes. Today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the discussion, it will be made available to rewatch. You will receive an email after the webinar concludes with a link to access the on-demand. We want to hear from you, so please feel free to send in your questions at any time throughout the program by using the Q&A tab. We will try to address as many as you send, so please get them in early. We also encourage discussion by using the chat tab. Let us know your thoughts, comments, suggestions, or just say a quick hello. I will also point out that there are some resources available for you to download from the Handouts tab. Finally, at the end of today's program, we will have a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. Stick around to see if you are one of today's 4 lucky winners. So let's go ahead and kick off our webinar today. Our topic is how to scale governance, compliance, and security through GitHub Actions. And I'm joined today by Mark Tomza, Senior Alliance Solutions Architect with Contrast Security, Kevin Gates, Principal Cloud Solution Architect with Microsoft, and Tommy Falgout, Senior Cloud Solution Architect from Microsoft. At this time, I'm pleased to let Mark get our conversation started. Thank you all for joining us today.
My name is Mark Tomza, and today I'm with Tommy Falgout and Kevin Gates, and this is a webinar going over how to scale governance, compliance, and security through GitHub Actions. Just a quick agenda before we get started. We'll start with introductions, brief intros with everyone on the line, an objective, so kind of what we're looking at, the current market strategies, what's happening in the market, the problem set, so what everyone is kind of hitting in terms of security and how to ingrain it from a compliance and a scale perspective, the solutioning, how it works in terms of solutioning, the GitHub action that we'll be employing in terms of medium to get this stuff out the door. Finally, we're going to have Kevin demo, and then any questions. So brief intros, I'll start. My name is Mark Tomza. I currently work on the alliances side with Contrast Security. And what I've been doing in the past 10 years or so is I've been in the software industry, kind of building from the ground up. I've been on both sides. I've been on the vendor side, services side, kind of a Swiss Army knife, if you will. But yeah, a lot of experience on both sides. I've been particularly interested in working with serverless technology, distributed tech, microservices, now security. So it's been super interesting. But yeah, I'll hand it off to Tommy.
Hey everyone, my name is Tommy Falgout. I am a cloud solution architect for Microsoft. I come from 20 years of Unix to Linux development. So security and baking solutions like this into the application is very near and dear to my heart. And I have been at Microsoft for 5 years, either as an evangelist or as a cloud solution architect.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kevin Gates. I am a principal cloud solution architect at Microsoft. I help our partners and customers build solutions on Azure. I have a focus in DevOps and Kubernetes and an increasing focus on security and how to secure some of those applications. I'm happy to be here with you today.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. So a little bit about the objective. What are we going to talk about? All right. So what's everyone talking about? Incorporating security at a ground level, scaling throughout the enterprise, right? So we're going to be hitting essentially 3 topics: acceleration, scale, and ensuring governance across the entire enterprise. And what we mean by that is accelerating to meet demand, because we all know that things are only getting faster, more moving parts, more software is getting super chaotic, right? In terms of scale, we want to cover the entire enterprise, right? We want to templatize things, make things super easy. In terms of overhead, we want 0 overhead. And in terms of the software lifecycle, we want to actually be mending the software lifecycle in terms of applications. So as an example, we want to have security throughout all of our apps. And so the business processes actually don't change. And before I move on, Tommy, do you kind of want to hit that note as well?
About the software development lifecycle? Absolutely.
Yeah, just like templating and basically scaling and stuff. I know we talked about it on and off our chats, so it'll be interesting to get your take.
Sure. So we just came back from KubeCon, and which is the annual, actually, well, biannual convention on Kubernetes. And one of the things we found really, really frequently as a common theme was that software development lifecycle and trying to secure that. Due to the executive order from President Biden, there's a huge push for that, and we're seeing more and more of these services and solutions coming up to try to address that.
Exactly. Yeah, it was funny because you actually hit the problem dead on. So as Tommy was stating, there has been a recent executive order from the government or the White House, whichever way you want to look at it, on application security and all things security to kind of give a baseline for companies, right? So they can actually not start from zero, so they don't have to catch up the entire way through. Recent breaches like Equifax, SolarWinds, the pipeline resourcing, Facebook, the ransomware stuff. I mean, Kevin, you can kind of give other examples as well, but I kind of want to hit on like basically what's been happening in the market and kind of how things have been evolving in terms of these breaches.
Yeah, I think it's a really important part. You know, you think about how much open source is being used in enterprise applications today. There is a lot of open source components that are flowing upstream into our applications, and it's more and more critical for everyone to have an eye on, you know, making sure that all of those packages, those vulnerabilities are secured so that you're bringing in more secure code into your own application.
Exactly. What comes in is what comes out. I tell people all the time, we don't sell software, we sell insurance, right? So you want to make sure your processes are solidified and that automation is taking those processes and scaling outward. And that goes to the current marketplace. We kind of touched upon this in the previous slide, but software is moving at light speed, right? There's been more innovation in the past year than the past 10 combined. So taking that into account, more moving pieces and basically more to keep track of. There's a problem. The world's evolving. Security, compliance, they're all being enforced because of things like that executive decision or basically act by the White House. Cyber warfare is becoming a daily occurrence, right? We have governments going head to head. We have products going head to head. We have corporations going head to head. And Tommy, you're shaking your head. It's pretty funny, but but it's true. Like security has been an afterthought for all these years, and now it's almost like opening the front door for hackers and malicious activity. So there's a huge need to shift left to make sure that that stuff's caught before it actually gets deployed in these environments. But what do we do with all this noise? Tommy can attest to this, and I know you have a little tidbit about that as well, if you want to cover that, about the noise and how false positives play into effect.
Oh, yeah. So one of the other things we saw from KubeCon was, again, there's a lot of noise out there and trying to figure out how DevSecOps teams can figure out exactly what are the actionable bits of information that they should be working with. Because if you have too much going at them, it's just overwhelming and they're not able to get their job. And so we even saw some solutions that were focused on exactly that, saying, hey, look, this is what you should be looking at. This is where you want to spend your time and attention. And we think that that helps make the developers and the operations team and the security teams way more efficient.
Exactly. And what Kevin's gonna be showing you guys a little later is basically the newest and greatest from contrast to Microsoft, the AKS GitHub Action, which is gonna focus basically on the value prop of the needing to shift left. So our problem statement, how do we get all this goodness from security, compliance, and governance everywhere in the enterprise, right? People like security, they like talking about it, but they don't really have an idea how to incorporate it within the enterprise and their value streams. So how do we do it? Well, first and foremost, you have to be ready to consume this stuff. Business processes, right? Business hierarchies. When we talk agile development, a lot of times old school, even companies like brick and mortar companies, like I always go with banks, financial institutions, insurance companies. I mean, there's stigmas, but they're still out there, right? From companies who kind of run old waterfall processes, and Tom is nodding his head. But you want to get to a point where like you're using cross-functional product teams to essentially bake in and get everyone in the same spot, right? In terms of team structure, so they don't have to reach out to those different departments to get things out the door. Things like DevOps, right? Breaking down those silos, and Kevin's breaking down his head, so I'll let him talk to a little bit. But you want to get to the point where you're incorporating these value streams like security, compliance, and audit within your cross-functional product teams through things like your product owner, and I'll hit that in a little bit. Kevin, you want to step in?
Yeah, a few things that we normally talk with some of our customers and partners about is, really that value of DevOps and how you can standardize and then automate the things that need to happen on a repeated basis. And so the important thing about standardizing is you're doing all your other security things like code scanning, secret scanning, build, and all that other good stuff. But it's really important that you're baking in security. And so you understand where your security vulnerabilities, and then you bake that into that process and just make it automated so that developers don't have to think about it. They continue doing their job, and then the pipeline is secure from end to end, all the way through production even.
And Tommy, you're nodding your head. I want your 2 cents on this.
I remember one of my favorite shirts was that I saw was "Don't go chasing waterfall," that someone had a coupon on it. And just that mindset of like, hey, look, we're going to have this, or we're going to do this, and these big chunks of software development, it doesn't really address some of the more immediate needs, and how you're talking about how quickly software development is coming. So you need to have that baked in early, baked in quickly, so that you can have more carry forward value as your application continues to grow.
100%. And to touch upon that, we'll kind of be showing diagrams of how this stuff works in-house, both from a business and technological standpoint. But people have to understand that DevOps does not equate speed, right? You want to get there in terms of like cloud native, right? But first, you have to have that culture where you're breaking down those silos and you're communicating. All DevOps does is break down those silos and ensure that communication and value streams are added toward the entire process and everyone knows their place. Does that make sense? To where you actually want to go through and you want to automate those processes, but not before you break down those silos, because I've seen a whole bunch of tool soup and tool processes that basically just create a bigger mess because things like to go fast, or people like to go fast, but don't realize that you can go as fast into a wall as anything else, right? To where if you don't have these processes actually committing to, I call it the software factory, where you're actually taking all these different value streams and molding it into a process that basically get your stuff out the door, it's gonna be a huge problem. And as Tommy mentioned, security is value carried down to the customer, and you have to ingrain those into your value streams. And that's where the product owner comes into play. So how does this all work? So what you guys see on the screen here is just a basic software delivery automation. I mean, there's different things, different nomenclatures, there's workflows, there's pipelines, there's a whole bunch of different stuff, right? But more or less what we're doing is we're taking the application and putting it through our software delivery pipeline or workflow, and ensuring that the right bits get on the right boxes or in the right environments, PaaS environments in our case, right, AKS, using the right gating systems, the right logic to where we're making data-centric decisions, right? So we have pieces of data and telemetry that are fed into different systems. So if there's an audit, compliance, or security protocol, they're ingrained at a fundamental level, right, at a foundational level to where you're not outside looking in. So Tommy mentioned that a lot of these companies, what they'll try to do is they'll try to indicate shortcomings in security, for example, and try to bootstrap it onto existing processes. That's fine and dandy until the rubber meets the road and you realize it's a lot harder than it sounds, right? Where you actually have to go through, and the way to do it, I don't want to mention naturally, but the best way I've seen it done is actually ingraining it in your cross-functional teams to where you actually have that security value prop within the team itself, and you're just consuming the automation as you see on the screen here and injecting security along the way. Does that make sense? And Kevin, you're nodding your head. Maybe you want to touch upon that.
No, I think we'll show some good examples of how you bake that security right into the pipeline, and then from there it becomes a template that gets used across the entire organization. So I think there's a lot of value in that important step.
Cool. So if you take a look at this diagram on the left, the software delivery automation is highlighted. So that's the previous slide. So that's basically your medium, right? That's being consumed by your application teams. This is very, very busy, but there's a reason it's busy, this diagram. So if you look at it, the diagram here shows a cross-functional team, a QA team, a dev team, a security team, paired with an app owner supporting application one, right? They're all allotted to go through and actually enhance the application and keep the application running. What the platform team does with the enterprise is actually bootstrap all the automation and inject all those value streams into a consumable point with that pipeline. So as an example, I have a pipeline with different APIs associated, whether they're Jira tickets, they're a security scan, they're a security implementation, they're a deployment, they're a build, they're a test. What happens is these application teams plug into these pipelines from the platform team and consume them. And Tom, you kind of nod your head if you want to jump in for a second and kind of elaborate on that as well.
Sure. So having worked at large companies as well, having that platform team and working with that platform team is really like a great way to segue, or like an easy on-ramp for a lot of the security.
Exactly. And this is kind of where we talk about like software factories. You probably heard that everywhere. You know, you want to create an assembly line. This is the assembly line as your pipeline. And what happens? Well, the teams actually go and they consume the assembly line. Well, who creates it? The platform team. And the next slide will kind of get into what the platform team represents within the enterprise. That glue where you'd normally be reaching out to those different departments to get those different tidbits to get software out the door. And as you can see here, this is the breakdown of what the platform team actually does in terms of turning that glue into formidable clay, as you will, so they can consume it within the pipeline itself. So here you have things like identity management, third-party integrations for, you know, Azure Active Directory, provisioning, right? ARM templates, Terraform, all that good stuff, issue tracking, you can do work items, Jira, you know, pick your tool, security, here I have contrast, audit, compliance. What these teams do is they inject their value into the value stream, right? Based on APIs. And the reason for that is because you want something to be super scalable within the enterprise. And nothing is more scalable than a computer doing the work. You don't want people going through and manually having to reach out to the different teams. So that's what was happening before. And that's what I mean by actually doing DevOps-y related things. In DevOps, what would happen is you're working with the platform team and these separate teams to actually create a workflow where I'm actually reaching out and making sure that that value is being captured, right? And that's where the pipeline automation comes into play. So now with the API layers, I don't have to reach out to those teams. I go and I hit the API, get certain information, inject certain pieces of data, and then have that pipeline scale outwards. Does it make sense? You guys both shaking your head. So Kevin, you kind of want to give an example of that?
Yeah, I would say, you know, I worked with partners where they have a platform team that's really there to make sure that everyone is following some of the key best practices. And so they're doing a lot of that hard work to figure things out, understand how all these different moving pieces can plug in to support the business and technical requirements. And then from there, they're onboarding different teams and applications and dev teams that want to now build. And so you're basically figuring that out once and then scaling that across the entire organization. And I think that's a challenge that many people are doing as they're embracing a new cloud.
Bingo. And then you want to actually templatize these workflows as well. And that's what we mean by the business processes don't change, right? Everything is a build, everything goes in, has a test, right? They have different gating systems. But essentially when you're working with the enterprise, whether it be a mainframe technology, a web server, microservices, Docker, Kubernetes, PaaS environments, whatever, serverless even, you want to make sure you're hitting the same business processes to make sure that everything is acting in the same manner. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And Mark, one thing you said, you're talking about looking at this as clay. I also like to think of looking at it as the mold. Yep. The mold is how you start being able to knock these out in a reproducible way that meets your standards and specifications.
Exactly, and you get into tools like Blueprints that actually packages all in one spot. We won't cover Blueprints in too much detail, but essentially it's almost like a self-service portal that can take all the automation and all those different points, right? And parameterize them to where I can get a business unit onboarded with a click of a button.
Yep.
So bringing it all together. So from those different slides, you get a pipeline that is consumable from the platform team to a development team, right? Well, we created abstractions via parameterizations. So I kept on talking about mainframe, web servers, and newer distributed technologies, right? In the cloud, serverless. Well, the application processes, right? Everything as a build, everything deploys, as an example. Those semantics are left to the application teams themselves. All they do is they plug into the actual pipeline. So the pipeline labels build. I don't care what kind of build it is, as long as the build happens, right? Same thing with security. I want to go through, plug into a security tool. I want to make sure from a compliance perspective, my compliance is met based on that framework, right? So it could be A, B, C. You don't really care as long as that team is meeting the KPI associated with that, right? And downward to actual, lower level environments and higher level environments, ultimately down to prod. You want to templatize this stuff, right? In this case, workflow templates that give teams the flexibility to do what they need to do at the team level, but then still keeping up with the enterprise business model. Does that make sense? And Tommy, maybe you can elaborate a little bit as well.
Oh, actually, I'm going to leave that one to Kevin because I think Kevin's got a good idea for that one.
Yeah, I think having flexibility is really important in how you're designing and making sure that you have enterprise constraints that are there, such as what actions can be pulled in, what are some of the mandatory tests that need to happen, but still giving a little bit of fluidity, and then honestly adding in manual approval where you see fit. And so you're not trying to completely automate everything end to end, but there are still opportunities to have human intervention. And so being able to inject some of those points into the workflow as well, I think is also important.
Exactly, it's 100%. And even to bring it forward a little bit into forward thinkers, right? Like if you are automating everything, you have to make sure that it's based off data and justifiable through that data, right? That telemetry needs to be fed through your tools and basically justified with compliance, audit, and all that good stuff. Tom, you have anything before I got to move in the next screen?
No, because I think we're about to start talking about how we actually do this, like implementation wise.
I know, I'm excited. All right, so to Tommy's point, wrapping it up. You want to incorporate security, compliance, and governance into the enterprise using automation, right? Scaling automation, templatizing it, but you have to be ready to consume it. And that's why I tell companies all the time, and working with companies for the past 10 years plus, if you're not ready to consume the tech, it's not going to make a difference. All it's going to do is basically create tool soup, and it's going to create a whole bunch of chaos in the enterprise because I don't want to mention conformity, but the way you templatize the actual business unit is by templatizing the automation, right? And that automation is based off your business processes. So if your business processes aren't up to par in terms of organizational standards for like DevOps, cloud native, and making sure everyone knows what's going on in terms of value stream and they're doing the right thing, it's all for naught. And Tom, you're nodding, but maybe you want to hit that point as well.
Yeah, you're talking about the automation being key. And the reason I like that is because with automation, you have tremendous pay forward value. I keep going back to that because that's the thing that we kept working on more and more at some of these other companies I've worked at. And being able to then have that baked in so that you can then move on to problems that are more of your core business, your core competencies. And, security is absolutely a must. And what you want to focus your attention on is your core competency. So this lets you do that.
Exactly. Kevin, you want to jump in before we actually get into the GitHub action?
You touched on something a little bit earlier, which is making sure you're doing that early on. And so step 0 as you're setting up your repo and getting people onboarded is to add those security elements so that it's something that the team gets used to, and everyone and all the visibility that you have into the application is something that you can get a feel for as you continue marching towards deployment.
I couldn't have said it better myself. So without further ado, we're going to get into GitHub Workflows and Actions. Tommy, floor is yours.
Awesome. So as you may have heard, Microsoft purchased this really popular development company called GitHub. And one of the things beyond just hosting GitHub repos that GitHub has been working on is the idea of GitHub Actions and GitHub Workflows. So what is a workflow? In this case, it's a pipeline that we're talking about, a pipeline for taking your code, running some actions on it, which we'll talk about a little bit more, and then having some output. This could be the artifact, this could be the actual application bundled up into some sort of image. And you want to do this whenever, say, there's a new code release or whenever there's a new package version. And these are what we call triggers. So you can have multiple workflows, you can have multiple things that are going on simultaneously or in parallel, serially or in parallel. And you can also have multiple triggers of like, great, there's a check-in, as I mentioned, or if there's a new code package. And this is how we see organizations really taking their application and again, standardizing it, having that pay for value, and being able to come up with those molds for how they want the rest of their application and the rest of their all the applications in their platform to work. So as I mentioned, a workflow is a pipeline, and those pipelines are made up of actions. The actions are kind of the building blocks of what we're working with. And you can inject these actions into your workflow. So for example, a common action we see is on a commit, on whenever there's something pushed to the GitHub repo, then we want to start running through this, going through this workflow. And that would be a series of actions. The first action would be check out all the code. The next action could be now start building it. The third action could be pushing it to some sort of repository. These actions are available on the GitHub marketplace, and you and your friends and your company can also come up with them. And yeah, I think that's kind of covers it.
Yep.
Good job,
Yeah,
Tom.
and that's one. Oh, sorry. So I'll just add to it. So basically, the cool thing about the marketplace is, as you all know, self-service is a big thing within the enterprise. And what the marketplace does, it enables that out of the box for the action. So what they can do, companies in general, they can go through, and as Thomas mentioned, you can use them as puzzle pieces and actually create a workflow from it and make it super scalable. So because of it, it becomes available, and you pretty much can do security out of the box without having to know much about it, which is great.
And well, as we were talking, there are many different solutions out there on the GitHub marketplace, and we have been working tightly with Mark and his team on a specific contrast security, AKS GitHub action.
Yep, thanks, Tommy. So the reason we built it was we wanted to get basically customers and prospects moving toward cloud implementations a lot more freely, but with control, if that makes sense. Easy consolidation of basically taking the code, and as Tom mentioned, you can go through every commit that happens. It just works. It's really nice in terms of consolidation for the steps needed to get things out the door. There's literally no onboarding. So a lot of times when tools come in and they say, oh, minimal onboarding, the word onboarding to me doesn't make sense when I look at tools. The fact that I have to go through and onboard it through my workflow process kind of defeats the purpose of me using the tool, right? So I want to look at the value props of the tool without having to just concentrate on it itself. So as an example, when Kevin goes and demonstrates the GitHub action, all we do is we pass in the API credentials, right, in terms of configurations, and anything we want in terms of application name, server name, very specific things that are pertinent to contrast in terms of record keeping. But outside of that, there's no onboarding. So in terms of the AKS GitHub action with contrast, what's going to happen is Kevin's literally just going to onboard the workflow and then copy and paste the YAML associated with the GitHub action, and that's it. So that's pretty neat. In terms of incorporating application security without any overhead, you don't, as I mentioned, you don't want to have the developer go outside their normal workflow. Developers do one thing, develop. And I tell us all the time to companies, when you're going through and you're having a developer actually go and commit code, you want them committing business value. You don't want them worrying about the toolage, right? Tool soup that's associated with getting your stuff out the door. Another big reason why I went this route is everyone's either moving or on Kubernetes. I mean, if you're in an enterprise and you're not using Kubernetes, I kind of question what you're doing. But in terms of GitHub, so Tommy and I were talking about this. I'm surprised I don't use this catchphrase, but GitHub is as close left as you can go, right? So you can only go as far as the code goes, which in this case is the repository itself, which makes GitHub Actions that much more powerful. It offers scale, coordination, governance, control, everything you need out of the box.
And one thing I realized is that, I don't know if we mentioned it, but AKS is Azure's Kubernetes service. So this is our first party solution for running Kubernetes as a service. And this solution will then take you all the way again from the developer right there to production in a Kubernetes instance.
Exactly. Thanks, Tommy. Yeah, I really got to get my acronyms straight. I got to spell them out before I actually dive into it.
Yeah,
thank you for the save. Yeah. So a couple of considerations for design. So if anyone's using Docker or OCI containers, which you probably are in enterprise, so microservices more or less, You want to make sure that developers aren't handcrafting their own solutions. They're recreating the wheel over and over again, messing with the Docker files and things like that, just because Tommy and I, so actually when we're going through and designing this, so it's funny because we went back and forth on how this should work. And there are a couple tools that you actually have to factor in, like, scanning tools that go through and scan your image to make sure they're truly immutable to what's inside their registry is what is deployed inside that environment, right? So that's just an instance of it. But essentially, you don't want developers going in and basically recreating the wheel. They want them focusing on the value of, committing those user stories and getting that stuff out the door. Second point is basically kind of pivots a little close to what I just mentioned. You want to make sure that the transparency is there in terms of image, right? And maintainability, to where you're not going through and creating multiple images that do the exact same thing, as an example. And the third point is the immutability aspect, right? You want to go through and make sure that what you committed is what is deployed in production, and third parties aren't going through and changing it, because then it becomes really, really hard to actually trace and record if things are actually being malicious or if it's routine operations. And Kevin, kind of nod there, maybe you can hit that as well.
I don't know if I would have anything to add. I think it's all very, very good points.
Actually, there's many, as we were talking earlier about the software development lifecycle, this is, again, something that we're seeing lots of attention on. And there's even open source projects. I forget the name of, there's a website, Salsa, which I think was a new thing that we saw from KubeCon, as well as an open source project called Notary, which was donated to the CNCF, which is all about, the entire project is making sure that you have what you're running in production is what was been trusted and developed by you and your team and not been modified.
Exactly. And that's what we took into account when we designed this, because the big thing here is you don't want to get into the practice of changing things like Docker files or whatnot, because A, it's messy. B, there are things like multi-stage Docker files where it gets even messier. So things can sprawl out of control really, really fast. And so what we did here is we simplified it. And we'll get into more detail down the line, but this kind of gives you a basis for how we designed it. So Kevin, maybe you want to start here in terms of talking about from a high level, what the action actually does.
Yeah, so one of the things that I like about GitHub Actions is it's almost like a 10-to-1 ratio in terms of you pull in one action, but behind the scenes, it's doing 10 things. And so we'll show you the example of the workflow file, but behind the scenes, the GitHub action, for contrast, is going to build your container image and then embed that security agent. The beauty behind that, once again, is there's nothing that the developer needs to do that's different from their normal workflow. And then the action will then push that image to the registry that you specify. When it's time to deploy, it will then also deploy that image to your target Kubernetes environment, your AKS environment, and then it'll make sure that all the other components of the deployment is recognized and is tagged appropriately with the security details. So in terms of inputs, we talked earlier about how your action takes in a set of information. And so there are some things that you're going to give us to make sure that those 10 things can happen behind the scenes. One is the path to your Docker file so that we can then build your image. You're going to give us the directory to your YAML files for Kubernetes, so your deployment and your service. You'll then give us your contrast specific information, so your key and your instance name. You'll also pass in your Azure specific information. So if you're using a service principal, we need to use that to then push your image to the registry. We need your cluster name, your image tag, and then the application that you're going to then pull into your Docker container.
Yep, and just to piggyback, the Docker name tag is the Docker name tag that's created once the contrast agent's actually baked inside.
Yep, very good point. And so this is a high level view of what that's going to look like. We're going to take your inputs. From there, we call Docker, we do your build. We then commit the app to the registry of your choosing. In this case, we're going to use Azure Container Registry, ACR, to push our image. We're then going to deploy that app to AKS, to whatever namespace, whatever cluster you have defined, and then we're going to update that with the contrast-specific information.
And before we get into the demo, Kevin's briefly going to touch upon what he's going to be doing in the demo.
Yes, so a few things we're going to do is one, set up the GitHub repository. You know, a big portion of what we wanted to do today was show you everything completely from scratch. So we're going to set up a brand new GitHub repository. We're then going to bake in some of the contrast security aspects directly into the workflow. Again, that is something that a developer doesn't have to do over and over again. It's just a one-time thing that we're doing, and we can pull that from a template. We then have a sample code, so an application that we're going to deploy, and then we're going to see that deployment happen, so we can watch all the steps of the GitHub action taking place all at the same time. And then we're going to look into the contrast dashboard and start to see all the things that the application is doing and our opportunities where we might be able to block something malicious that's happening.
Awesome, thanks, Kevin. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to give Kevin the helm, but before I do that, I just want to hit up on contrast, because I completely forgot to mention what contrast security actually is. It's an application security platform that basically we're going to be looking at assess and protect in this regard. But what we do is we take your application, reside within the app using sensors, so it's agent based, and this is why we're doing this in the AKS GitHub action. What happens is the agent gets baked into the image itself, and then we pass configuration files within the PaaS environment. So Kubernetes specific things like secrets and environment variables, right? And that telemetry will then be fed into the contrast server, which then will be used for actionable items like creating work items. And this is kind of how you create the feedback loops with the security person working with the application owner and creating those work lists or work items for a developer to work on. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop screen sharing.
Great. I am going to then share my screen and pull up our contrast. Okay, so here we can see our contrast GitHub repo. As we mentioned earlier, a big part of what we wanted to show you was being able to do all of these things from scratch. And so what you can see here is my GitHub repo, and it only has a few different things inside of it. One is our example application. And so if I jump into here, we can see that we're going to use a Java-based pet clinic application. So this is just a jar file that we're going to pull into our Docker container. And then here we can see our actual Docker file. And so here we're pulling a Java-based image, we're setting some variables. Here we're pulling in that Java-based application, and then we're kicking off the app with our entry point and the ports that we're exposing. As we mentioned before, there's no modification needed to the Docker file itself. And so the developer and the application will continue to be built and developed without the knowledge of contrast being put into the Docker file.
Exactly. One thing I'll note before Kevin gets into the Kubernetes portion, but this demo just basically takes a built artifact, but normally you'd have a build associated with it. So it works both ways. And that's kind of with one of the inputs where you have an artifact location for the input. The artifact is basically all the files that will be needed by the Docker file itself.
That is a very good point. So there could be things happening upstream in the workflow that gets pulled in terms of artifacts. But in this example, we're pulling in a Java-based one.
Like a Maven build or whatnot, but yeah.
Yep. The next thing that we have in this repository is our Kubernetes files. In this case, it's just a single one. But if we take a look at it, it is your typical deployment. So we're creating our pet clinic application. We're pointing to an image, and then here we're exposing our service. And then if I jump back to the root, the other thing that we have inside of this repo is our sample workflow. And so a big part of what we talked about today was the ability of templatizing the things that you're doing so that you just have security baked in. And so this could be something that a single business unit uses, or, as we talked about earlier, being flexible. Different business units could have a different template that they use for their builds, but they all can bake in that security right at the workflow level. And so this is a GitHub workflow file. It is YAML based. So you're able to describe all the steps that the workflow needs to do on a repeated basis in code. And so here we're saying every time there's a push to the main branch, we want all of the steps in this workflow to take place. So here we're setting some environment variables. Some of these variables are the image name, as we can see here. And as Mark mentioned, that's going to be what will get pushed into the container registry. We're pointing to our YAML file that will get deployed, our Docker file for the build, our AKS cluster name, and then the artifact that we're pulling in. And then this workflow here has one single job, that's build and deploy. But as we mentioned, you may have other steps that are taking place that then feed into this contrast action.
Exactly. And maybe Kevin, you want to click the edit button so you can show the marketplace?
Yes. So here, if I click on the edit, we'll see that there's basically two steps happening. One is pulling down the code onto the agent that's running this workflow. And then the second step is to actually call the contrast agent. And if we took a look at this here, oh, I need to show the marketplace a little bit later. So I won't show it here now. Yeah. But when I show you later, we'll see the marketplace on the right-hand side, and we'll see where the contrast agent is in the marketplace.
Sounds
but
good
here,
to
as
me.
we mentioned, our step is to call the contrast agent, and then we're passing in values that are specific to Azure regarding our service principal. So it has permission to do things inside of the subscription or resource group. And then we're pulling in the details so that it can hook into the contrast cloud.
It's awesome stuff.
Okay, so at this point, what we're going to do is just take a peek at the container registry and the cluster just to show you that there's nothing in our sleeves. And so if we look at my container registry, this is my contrast ACR. And under the repositories field here, we have no repositories. And then if I look at my newly baked AKS cluster, we only have the typical servers that come out of the box with AKS. So what we're going to do here is use this as our template and build out a brand new repository. And so I'm going to come here and click on import repository and do that in the new tab. It's going to ask me for my repository that we're cloning. I'm just going to use the one that I just showed you. And then I'm going to name this Pet Clinic Demo. And then begin this import. Now, as we talked about before, this could be something that can be automated. It's a very important step to make sure that you're making it drop dead simple for people to onboard with a new repository. So as you're importing things, you can import that workflow file that already has the contract agent baked in and any other things that you might want to do from a security standpoint, such as code scanning, secret scanning, dynamic and static analysis, all those great things that you would do to make sure that your application is secure and functioning correctly.
Yep, exactly. Like we were hitting upon this when we're actually designing is we don't want the developer to change their current workflow. Basically, it's just creating a repository, copying and pasting YAML, and they're done.
Yep. So this will finish here in a second. It's got to copy over that large jar file. But we can now see that our repository is complete. So brand new repository, and we're going to start going through and configuring this for building the application. So the next thing we're going to do is take a look at our workflow file again. And if we remember, there were down here some environment variables that we need to tweak, and then some secrets that we need to create. In the case of environment variables, these things are not particularly sensitive, and so we can store them here out in the clear for contributors of the project to see. But there may be things that are secrets, like our service principal or the credentials to use with Azure. We would want to make sure that those are hidden away. So what we're going to do is head over to settings and then create our secrets for the action. So here I'm going to come over and create a new repository secret. And then for my secret name, I'm going to just use the ones that have been predefined in that workflow file. So we're going to have contrast credentials file, and I'm going to paste in the JSON blob that has my API, my username, my key, etc., so that this gets registered inside of the contrast dashboard. And then the next one I create is going to be my Azure credentials file, and that will have my service principal so that the workflow is able to go in and push our image to the cluster into the registry. So now I have my secrets defined. And the next thing I'm going to do is copy this into our workflow for the actual project. So I'm going to come over here to Actions. And because I don't have a workflow already, it is showing me the marketplace, and it will look at my project and suggest actions that I could use to work with my project, whether it's Docker-based, C#, Java, Python, it'll suggest things. But what I'm going to do is just come here and set up an action right from scratch. So this is just a very simple hello world workflow here, but we're going to customize this and copy in what we had from our workflow file that we just took a look at. So I will come here, delete this, and then paste in the exact same data that we had in the workflow file. The only thing that we've changed here is the image name, and then we're incrementing this so that every time this workflow runs, it's going to add a new image tag so that we can continue to have new container images that are immutable, similar to what Mark talked about earlier.
You got fancy, Kevin.
Yeah, I added my cluster name. And so here it's targeting our correct cluster, and then everything else is the same. And so we see that it's pulling in that contrast action. And let's take a look at that inside of the marketplace. So if I search for contrast, we'll see that there's two contrast actions here, one for Spring Cloud, the other one for AKS, which is the one that we're using today. So if I click on this one and then view the full marketplace listing, we will see, similar to that open source world, you can see all of the work that's going into the actions that you're using. So you can examine and look at the source of that. And this details all of the inputs that you need to supply, which is what we've done already, which is our Azure credentials, contrast credentials, Docker file, etc. And then this gives you a very clear example of how to configure that inside of your workflow, which is what we've already done down here. So with that, I think we have everything we need. So we've pasted in our YAML. So we're going to now commit this workflow to our repository. And as we mentioned, anytime something gets pushed to main, this workflow will run. And so just us committing this file to main means that this workflow now is going to run every single time, including just now. So I'll come over here to Actions, and here we can see our workflow that we just created. And it is now queuing up our action to run. Very similar to other pipelines like in Azure DevOps, you can come and look at every single step that's taking place. And so here we can see our single job, which is build and deploy, is going to kick off and run, and we're able to follow that along as it's executing. And I'll let Mark here comment on all of the wonderful magic that's happening behind the scenes.
Sure. Thanks for giving such precise instructions. No, it's pretty awesome stuff. So what's happening here is essentially it's checking out the code. It's doing the contrast portion, right? It's going to be about 2 to 3 minutes for this demo, if I don't forget. But essentially what happens is it builds the entire environment. It's packaged in a Docker file, right? So it builds that container, and then I also nest other containers in there. And the reason for that is essentially creating an environment to where I can use them as puzzle pieces, the Docker images, so I don't have to load it every single time. And they're completely immutable. So as you can see here, I'm passing in the user credentials and their inputs, setting up as arguments, and then passing those arguments as environment variables within the container itself. So they're made available to the operations running inside. And this will take about another minute or two. But once this kicks off, there's a file called entrypoint.sh. And what this file does is the actual action logic itself. So it'll actually build the predetermined Docker file into a Docker image. It'll run the Docker image. And as it runs it, there's actual a volume mount that happens behind the scenes, injects the contrast agent via volume, and then it commits the image to the ACR, so basically to the registry. So this takes the contrast file and actually injects it into the container and makes the image from that running container without actually editing the Docker file. That's how it works. And then once it hits the registry, it gets deployed to AKS, Azure Kubernetes service. And then once that's up and running, I actually do a rolling update. And in that update, the image that was actually deployed to the registry gets deployed to that environment via rollout. I check the deployment, pass in some environment variables and secrets, and make sure there's connectivity. And so you'll get outputs from all this, but you can actually see here it's being pushed to the registry. So Kevin did a great job at creating a service principal, making sure it has all the right permissions and whatnot. And there you go, success, it's been pushed to the registry. And now we're logging into the Azure CLI, making sure we're all good there. And here it's deploying to AKS, as you can see. And so the outputs are basically just YAMLs that you normally see from regular operations of Kubernetes. And right now the roll up and the update and the image is making sure that's updated. And it's as simple as that. So Kevin, if you go back to the contrast specific step, the contrast security.
So as we can see here, the workflow finished. And if we drill down into our contrast step, we scroll all the way to the bottom and we will see a endpoint URL for us to go visit and try out the application. So as we mentioned before, just a sample application is designed to show you how a user can interact with the app, but behind the scenes, all of these interactions are being logged and allowed to proceed. So I'm going to click on Find Owner. This called one of the functions in the app, gave me back all of the owners for this particular pet. But what we really want to do is see what this interaction looks like inside of Contrast. So I will come here to the app. This is our application that we registered inside of Contrast. I'll just hit refresh just to make sure we have the latest data here. And then we get a nice dashboard view of all the interactions of the app.
And as Kevin mentioned, so the onboarding completely took place. So an onboarding application, the server with the application, what you see on the screen here is a grade. And that grade is comprised basically a library score, an overall score, and a protect score, and a custom code score, sorry. Forgot about that part. But essentially what Contrast does is it sets up criteria based on rule sets and gives you a grade score based on those rule sets to kind of see your security posture overall. So here it's an F, which is not the greatest, but a lot of companies actually start here, to be honest. So what they'll do is they'll start here, they'll start doing their enhancements, and they'll see the grade progress from F to like a C, B, or even in some instances an A. And Kevin, if you want to click on the vulnerabilities, what Contrast does, it actually captures, and you can see the last detected. So as Kevin was instrumenting the application, it interactively went through and collected information through his clicks to actually go through and show the vulnerabilities associated with it. So if you click into the MD hash algorithm right here, yep, you get a whole bunch of value presented here. So you get an overview, what happened, what's the risk with the vulnerability itself. You click into details, you get a little more information. Yep, right there. You can actually click into it. So yeah, Kevin, you can click into that. You can go all the way down to see more. You go down to the stack trace level. So this is how we help developers actually code more security, is you go through, you identify the vulnerability associated with what's happening with your application, and we even give you the details on how to fix it. So Kevin, if you click on how to fix, yep, Contrast actually shows you from a code base the references to CWEs, the OWASP, the reference material, and the code to actually change to make it safe and secure, which is a huge value prop. You don't need to be a security expert to do security in-house. And Tom, you're nodding because that's actually the response we get every single time we come in-house and actually instrument this stuff, because more or less security is something like we were talking about, you want to ingrain at a fundamental level. You can't really do that if you're having to spend, all your time getting up to speed on what security actually is. You want to do it day one, and that's how contrast helps.
And this is the signal that makes it useful for developers.
Exactly. This is the telemetry that we're talking about. So Kevin, if you go into libraries, you can actually click into the libraries. So you can click into the 6 for bootstrap.jar, fourth one down. Yep. So here you have CVEs associated with the actual jar files itself. They're being used by the application, but none of the classes are. So here you can actually go through, and Ty mentioned a couple times that you want to limit the noise. This is how you limit the noise. So Kevin, if you click back and you go into the route section, you can actually see which routes in terms of route coverage. So yep, are being exercised in your app. So you want to get in the practice of actually going through and making sure you're as close to 100% as you can be in terms of route coverage. But this is where you'd start in actually seeing how people are actually interacting with your applications and how your CVEs and vulnerabilities are being filtered into the application as well, right? And if you click in flow map, you get a topology of the application itself. So database, the actual service that's associated with it. It's pretty cool stuff, nice visual. And then if you click in policy, next to the flow map, you can control policies both from assess and protect. So again, assess identifies vulnerabilities and lets you aggregate those vulnerabilities. Protect, if you click into that tab, yep. And if you type in, for example, SQL injection into, search, you can see here the rule for SQL injection. And in development, QA, or production, what you can do is, if you click that, you can monitor it, or you can block it, or almost use like a WAF, like block the perimeter. But essentially what happens here is for that vulnerability or that exploit, if it's something that's being attacked, what contrast does is step in front and bubbles up the exception to where, if, as an example, if you have an input associated with SQL injection, you can make it to where no IP is lost because contrast actually blocks the interaction with the element itself. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I like that a lot.
So Kevin, if you go up to your name in the top right, and you click in organizational settings, and you click on integrations, this is what we mean by incorporating this into your value stream. So we have all these integrations here that basically take the telemetry from your interaction with contrast. So all the goodies you get with the security implementation with contrast, right, with the GitHub action, out of the box, you can take that telemetry and actually filter it into other tools. So as an example, you can use Jira, you could use DevOps, work items, you could do a whole bunch of different things, but this is where the teams would actually interact with each other. So as an example, if I find vulnerabilities and it matches certain criteria, I can create tickets automatically and then have in that cross-functional team, remember that diagram that we showed, the product owner or the application owner work with the security person within that team to actually segregate and prioritize work items for a developer to actually work on. So that's how it works in terms of feedback. Does that make sense to you guys? And maybe you guys want to step in and kind of talk to that as well.
I was just going to say it's a very important point because there are few organizations using just one single tool for everything. And so having these integrations and hooks that allow you to integrate with other party or other products that you're using in your DevOps ecosystem is really critical.
Exactly. And Tom, you want to step in?
No, I pretty much exactly what Kevin said is that they're like Lay's potato chips. Once you pop, you just can't stop. And there's just more and more tools that keep making the entire ecosystem.
Exactly. And this is what we talk about, basically incorporating those feedback loops into your value stream and that assembly line, ultimately your software factory, to where you're scaling things, in this case, using GitHub Actions, right? Templatizing it, making sure the developer is not going outside their current workflow, but capturing all that telemetry and feeding it into necessary tool sets to make sure you can go and start enhancing it literally day one without going outside your current responsibilities. So really cool stuff. And actually, that's pretty much it. So if you guys have nothing else, we're going to conclude our webinar. But thanks again, Kevin and Tommy from Microsoft. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. But this was a pleasure. And as always, thank you.
Well, outstanding. As we are approaching the top of the hour, if there were any questions that went unanswered, we will be sending those over to our hosts. So I'm sure they will get to those and they will get those answered for you as soon as possible. A quick reminder that today's session was recorded, so if you missed any or all of the presentation or you would just like to rewatch, it will be made available. Following the webinar, you will receive an email with a link to access the recording on demand. You can also find the recording living on the DevOps website. Just visit devops.com/webinars and look in the on-demand section. It will be waiting for you. Now on to our 4 winners of our $25 gift card drawing. Our first winner is Daniel P. Congratulations, Daniel. Our second winner is Tom T. Congratulations, Tom. Our third winner is Alan D. Congratulations, Alan. And our fourth winner is Vyacheslav K. So congratulations, Vyacheslav. Congratulations to the 4 of you. Please keep an eye on your inbox and claim your gift card as soon as possible. If you don't receive an email, just make sure to check your spam folder. Mark, Kevin, Tommy, thank you so much for taking the time to put together this awesome presentation. And I would also like to thank our audience for being with us for the entirety of today's program. This is Cody J. Brown signing off. Have a great day, everybody.